This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about something that almost nobody in the productivity and execution space is talking about honestly. Not mindset, not habits, not identity or environment or implementation intentions or any of the psychological frameworks I have shared on this channel before. Today we are going to the body, specifically to the part of your body that has been making your scheduling decisions, your avoidance decisions, and your execution decisions without your conscious awareness or your permission for your entire adult life, your nervous system. And I want to be clear from the very beginning about why this conversation is different from everything else you have heard about why you don't follow through. Every framework I have shared on this channel, Gollwitzer's implementation intentions, Dweck's mindset research, Lewin's environmental design, Skinner's reinforcement systems, all of it operates at the level of psychology and behavior, and all of it is genuinely useful. I would not have shared it if it weren't. But underneath all of it, underneath the psychology, underneath the behavior, underneath the identity and the environment and the habits, there is a physiological layer that most execution content never reaches, a layer that, when it is dysregulated, makes every other intervention significantly less effective. Like trying to build on a foundation that is quietly shifting beneath you, that layer is your autonomic nervous system. And once you understand how it operates, and specifically how it operates in the context of the tasks you most need to execute, you will finally have an explanation for something that no amount of mindset work has ever fully resolved. Why you can know exactly what to do, understand precisely why you need to do it, have the system, the plan, the intention, the environment, and still sit frozen in front of the work as if an invisible force is physically holding you in place. That force is not invisible, it is biological, and it has a name. I want to describe something I experienced so regularly during my years of non-execution that it became a kind of background weather in my life. So familiar I stopped noticing it as something unusual. Every morning during the worst years, the years of rebuilding after the collapse, I would sit down at my desk with the full intention to begin the most important work of the day, the work that was actually building the new business, the calls that needed to be made, the decisions that needed to be committed to. And something would happen that I never had a satisfying explanation for. It was not quite anxiety in the way I understood anxiety. It was not quite fear. It was a kind of physical heaviness, a subtle but persistent tension across my chest and shoulders, a restlessness that made sitting still feel almost uncomfortable. A pull, not toward anything specific, just away from the desk, away from the task, toward movement, toward distraction, toward anything that felt less like sitting still in front of something that mattered. And the harder I tried to override it, the more I applied willpower and discipline and all the psychological tools I had accumulated, the more exhausted I became, until by mid-afternoon I was genuinely depleted. Not from doing the work, from fighting the physical state that made doing the work feel impossible. I told myself it was a motivation problem, a discipline problem, a mindset problem. I tried to think my way through it and around it and past it. What I did not know, what nobody had ever told me, was that what I was experiencing had almost nothing to do with my thoughts or my character or my commitment level. It was a nervous system response, automatic, ancient, and completely indifferent to my intentions. And until I understood that, really understood it at a physiological level, no amount of psychological intervention was going to resolve it completely. To understand what is happening in the body when execution fails, we need to start with the foundational science of the autonomic nervous system, and specifically with the work of Dr. Stephen Porges at the University of North Carolina, whose Polyvagal Theory has become one of the most important frameworks in modern neuroscience for understanding the relationship between physiological state and human behavior. Porges spent decades mapping the autonomic nervous system and its influence on behavior, cognition, and what he calls social engagement. His research identified 3 distinct physiological states that the autonomic nervous system cycles between in response to perceived levels of safety and threat in the environment. The first state is what Porges calls the ventral vagal state. This is the state of physiological safety. When the nervous system is in this state, when it has assessed the environment as safe and non-threatening, the body is calm, the prefrontal cortex is fully online, cognitive flexibility is high, creativity is accessible, and sustained focused attention is neurologically available. This is the state in which your best execution happens, in which the work flows, in which starting feels manageable and continuing feels natural. The second state is sympathetic activation. This is the fight or flight state. When the nervous system perceives threat, real or imagined, physical or psychological, it shifts into this state automatically and without conscious permission. Heart rate increases, muscle tension rises, blood flow redirects away from the prefrontal cortex and toward the large muscle groups needed for physical response. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the system. And here is the critical point that most productivity content completely misses. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, decision-making, sustained attention, and deliberate execution, is significantly impaired in sympathetic activation, not slightly reduced, measurably, functionally impaired. The cognitive resources you rely on to execute complex, important work are simply less available when your nervous system is in a threat state. The third state is what Porges calls the dorsal vagal state, a state of shutdown, freeze, and withdrawal that the nervous system activates when threat feels inescapable. This is the heaviness I described sitting at my desk, the inability to move toward the work, the frozen quality that looks like laziness from the outside and feels like paralysis from the inside. Now, here is what makes this relevant to everything you have been calling a discipline problem. The tasks that matter most to you, the ones that carry the highest stakes, the greatest visibility, the deepest connection to your identity and your future, are precisely the tasks most likely to trigger a sympathetic or dorsal vagal response in your nervous system, not because they are physically dangerous, but because the nervous system does not distinguish between physical threat and psychological threat with any meaningful precision. The high-stakes client call, the creative project that exposes your real capability, the financial decision with irreversible consequences, the difficult conversation that could change a relationship permanently. These tasks are psychologically threatening in ways that the nervous system registers as threat, full stop. And when the threat response activates, when the nervous system shifts out of the ventral vagal window of tolerance and into sympathetic activation or dorsal vagal freeze, your capacity for the sustained, focused, high-quality execution those tasks require is neurologically compromised. You are not failing to execute because you lack discipline. You are failing to execute because you are trying to do your most cognitively demanding work from a physiological state that makes cognitively demanding work significantly harder. This is also supported by the research of Dr. Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, whose decades of work on stress in the brain documented what he called allostatic load, the cumulative physiological cost of chronic stress on the brain and body. McEwen found that sustained activation of the stress response, the kind that chronic non-executors experience every day as they sit in front of the avoided work accumulating guilt and anxiety, produces measurable changes in prefrontal cortex function, working memory capacity, and the ability to regulate emotion and sustain attention. The longer the avoidance continues, the more physiologically compromised the capacity for execution becomes. The nervous system is not just responding to the threat of the task, it is responding to the accumulated stress of the avoidance itself. There is also critical research here from Dr. Peter Levine, the somatic psychologist and developer of somatic experiencing, whose work on the physiology of trauma and stress responses found that unresolved threat responses do not simply disappear when the perceived threat passes. They are stored in the body as residual tension, incomplete action patterns, and a chronically elevated baseline of nervous system activation. For people who have experienced significant professional failure, public humiliation, or repeated experiences of high-stakes execution going wrong, the body carries a memory of those experiences that activates automatically when similar high-to-stakes situations are approached again. This is why the person who has failed before finds it harder to begin again, not just psychologically but physiologically. The body remembers, and the body's memory triggers the threat response before the mind has had time to make a conscious assessment. So here is the practical framework, built entirely on the physiology, not the mindset, not the habits, but the body itself. The first intervention comes directly from Porges's polyvagal research and addresses the most immediately actionable lever available for shifting the nervous system out of threat activation and into the ventral vagal window of tolerance where execution becomes neurologically accessible. It is breathing, specifically extended exhale breathing. I know how that sounds. I know breathing advice has become so ubiquitous in wellness content that it has started to feel meaningless, but I want to give you the precise physiological mechanism so you understand why this is not a relaxation technique. It is a direct intervention on the autonomic nervous system. The vagus nerve, the primary pathway of the parasympathetic nervous system and the central mechanism of Porges' polyvagal system, is directly influenced by the breathing pattern. Specifically, extending the exhale beyond the length of the inhale activates the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and begins to shift the nervous system toward the ventral vagal state. Inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 8. Repeat for 90 seconds before beginning any high-stakes task. 90 seconds, not 10 minutes of meditation, not a complete morning routine rebuild, 90 seconds of physiological intervention that directly addresses the nervous system state that has been making your most important work neurologically inaccessible. Dr. Andrew Huberman at Stanford, whose neuroscience research on the nervous system and performance has become some of the most practically accessible work in the field, identifies this extended exhale breathing as one of the fastest and most reliable methods available for shifting the autonomic nervous system state in real time. His research specifies what he calls the physiological sigh, a double inhale through the nose followed by an extended exhale through the mouth, as particularly effective for rapid parasympathetic activation. Do this before you sit down to the most important work of the day, not after the avoidance has already begun. Before, as a deliberate physiological preparation for execution, the second intervention addresses what Levine's somatic experiencing research identified as the incomplete action patterns stored in the body around high-stakes tasks. This is the residual physiological activation that accumulates when threat responses are triggered but never discharged. The tension that builds in the body every time you approach the feared task and retreat from it without completing the approach. The intervention is graduated exposure. Drawing from the behavioral research of Dr. Joseph Wolpe, the psychiatrist whose systematic desensitization research at Stanford demonstrated that fear responses can be extinguished through repeated graduated exposure to the feared stimulus in a state of physiological calm. The prescription is to deliberately approach the feared task in the smallest possible increment while maintaining physiological regulation, not to push through the threat response with willpower, to reduce the size of the approach until the nervous system can accompany you to the starting point without activating a full threat response. Then stop. Breathe. Register that you approached and survived. Tomorrow, approach slightly further. You are not trying to complete the task on day 1. You are teaching your nervous system, through repeated graduated experience, that approaching this task does not produce the catastrophic outcome the body has been predicting. Each successful approach without catastrophe reduces the threat response for the next approach. This is desensitization at the physiological level, and it works not because you thought your way through the fear, but because you moved your body through it repeatedly until the nervous system updated its threat assessment. The third intervention addresses MC Ewan's allostatic load research, the cumulative physiological cost of chronic stress and avoidance. And it is the simplest of the 3. You must discharge the stress response physically before you attempt to execute cognitively. Ms. Ewan's research showed that physical movement, specifically rhythmic bilateral physical activity like walking, running, or swimming, is one of the most effective mechanisms available for reducing cortisol levels and restoring prefrontal cortex function after stress activation. Not because exercise is good for you in a general health sense, because the stress response was designed by evolution to be completed through physical action. The threat was perceived, the body mobilized for action, the action discharged the activation, and the nervous system returned to baseline. In modern life, the threat is perceived, the high-stakes task sits on the calendar, the body mobilizes, and then nothing happens. The activation has nowhere to go, it accumulates, and the prefrontal cortex remains partially offline, while the cortisol stays elevated and the execution capacity stays compromised. 10 minutes of brisk walking before your most important execution block is not a lifestyle choice. It is a physiological preparation that directly restores the neurological resources your execution depends on. Mac Ewan's research is specific and unambiguous on this point. Move the body before you ask the mind to do its most important work. I want to close with something that reorganized the way I understand the years I spent fighting myself at that desk. I was not losing a battle of willpower. I was asking a nervous system in threat activation to perform the cognitive functions that threat activation was specifically designed to shut down, and then judging myself for the predictable result. The body is not the enemy of execution. It is the vehicle of it. And a vehicle that is running a threat response is not a vehicle that needs more discipline applied to it. It is a vehicle that needs to be brought back to the physiological state where the engine can actually run. Stephen Porges spent his career showing us that safety, felt safety, physiological safety, nervous system safety, is the prerequisite for the highest human functioning, not a luxury, not a soft concern for people who can't handle pressure. The literal biological precondition for the prefrontal cortex activity that makes complex execution possible. Your calendar is not a discipline problem. Your calendar is a nervous system problem. And nervous system problems have nervous system solutions. Breathe first. Move the body. Approach gradually. Let the physiology lead. Everything else follows. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology. And I will see you in the next one.